Welcome back. I am pleased to start the second half of our symposium, Revealing Communities, the Archaeology of Free African Americans in the 19th Century, with our first speaker of the afternoon, Nedra Lee. Nedra is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and she received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin, which I realized rhymed. Her research interests include the archaeology of the African diaspora, gender, and processes of racial formation during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She has conducted research on historic Black sites in Texas that have included extensive collaboration with descendant communities. And she has received funding from the Ford Foundation and the Texas Historical Commission. Her research has been published in the Bulletin of the Texas Archaeological Society, and Nedra also conducts research on Native American and African American community, the community of New Guinea on the island of Nantucket. So I welcome Nedra to the podium, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, and good afternoon. The emancipation of roughly 4 million Blacks brought a radical change in Southern society. The abolition of slavery uprooted a social and economic system that made Blacks the foundation to white wealth, political privilege, and ideological claims of racial superiority. Emancipation offered the promise of citizenship and equality to both free and formerly enslaved Blacks. Freedom did not simply mean autonomy over one's labor and time. Emancipation contained the hopes and possibilities for Blacks to obtain family intimacy, bodily integrity, sexual freedom, mobility, citizenship, and livelihood. However, emancipation also yielded the continuation and, in some instances, an escalation of racial violence and oppression that came to rival the antebellum period. The advent of Jim Crow segregation is one of the most defining features of the post-war period. Racial segregation stands with slavery as one of the greatest scars on American history. Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton cite the significance of segregation to the structural undermining of Black well-being through highly concentrated poverty, vast unemployment or underemployment, educational failure, and social and physical deterioration long into the present time. Scholars such as C. Van Woodward, Eric Foner, Edward Ayers, and Grace Hale all note that segregation aimed to put Blacks into a subservient place following the abolition of slavery. Foner states that as a small yet increasing number of freed men and women begin to form an aspiring middle class through the acquisition of literacy, property, and wealth, segregation maintained white control by policing Blacks in these realms. This paper seeks to augment contemporary or mainstream understandings of Jim Crow segregation in the South with an analysis of the Ransom and Sarah Williams farmstead in Manchac, Travis County, Texas. Although popular representations of Jim Crow segregation depict rigid racial barriers across space, the archaeological study of the Ransom and Sarah Williams farmstead stands in contrast to this image. The Williams farmstead's location in a predominantly white farming community appears to be an anomaly, considering the increased efforts of whites to marginalize Blacks during the postbellum period. Moreover, the site, Rose Colony, Antioch Colony, and the Prayer. I know it says Prairie, but they call it the Prayer in Texas. All of these are African American communities that were founded in the 1870s. And so you're going to get an idea of this dispersed community as I keep talking. So the Williams farmstead appears to be an anomaly, considering the increased efforts of whites to use space to marginalize Blacks during the postbellum period. Moreover, Ransom Williams' socioeconomic position as a landowner spurs us to ask exactly what strategies the family employed to survive during a time of heightened racial exclusion. The study of the physical landscape of the Williams farmstead is necessary to understand the lives and experiences of Ransom and Sarah Williams because it considers how space is embedded with social meaning. Race is a social construct that relies on power and physical markers of difference to classify groups of people. Although race is rooted in perceived biological differences, it gains its weight in structural, material, and spatial inequalities that it both produces and relies upon to sustain political and economic privilege. In Southern society, there was a symbolic and physical relationship between race and space. Many white Southerners believed that Blacks were innately inferior to them and had a specific place in Southern society as a class of laborers. While slavery and the emergent sharecropping and tenancy system ensured that Blacks were a constant source of exploitable labor, there was also an epistemological framework that undergirded this. In her 1939 study of a rural Mississippi community, Hortense Powdermaker outlined the chief articles of faith in Southern society, which outlined not just what was considered Blacks' rightful place in society, but the mechanisms to ensure it. As evidence with Articles 2 and 5, and I'm happy to go back to the slide so we can, if you would like to read all 15 of them, race was tied to a geographic locale, the South, and to a particular position both socially, beneath whites, and economically, always in a position of service or hard work. The material world played an important role in both shaping the conceptualization and perception of blackness in space. The separation of the races in space, labor, leisure, and death worked to reinforce whites' beliefs in their superiority, despite the legal abolition of slavery. However, recent studies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries have highlighted the strange operation of Jim Crow and how it varied from place to place. For example, Lauren Schwinninger noted that it was not uncommon for Blacks and whites to live near each other in rural communities, and that the vast majority of rural Black landholders in the lower South lived in areas with neighboring white farmers. Black landowners in these areas did not live in racial harmony. Let me repeat that. Black landowners in these areas did not live in racial harmony with their neighbors. Instead, they often forged chilly bonds of amity according to the harsh needs and vagaries of agricultural life. Historian Mark Schultz states that in these areas, life was marked by a culture of personalism that in one sense refers to the personal nature of power, and in another points to the face-to-face nature of rural communities which allowed greater flexibility than was found in areas where Black and white people related to one another primarily as impersonal abstractions. In rural areas, whites and Blacks could be found working together in agricultural endeavors, occasionally helping each other in times of need, or sometimes fishing and hunting together. Black women became important transgressors of racial boundaries as their work as midwives, nurses, cooks, or domestics gave them access to the most private and intimate aspects of whites' lives. Yet social distance was maintained between Blacks and whites through a demeaning social etiquette that precluded whites from properly addressing Blacks with titles like Mr. or Miss and the regulation of childhood play. Violence also greatly figured into this, as the countryside some of the highest rates of lynching and mob violence and instances of one-on-one physical assault were commonly utilized to intimidate in these communities. Historical and archaeological research of the Ransom and Sarah Williams farmstead suggests that the Williams family likely resided in a community that was similar to what I just described above. Archaeologists with Pruitt and Associates Incorporated, a cultural resource management firm in Austin, Texas, excavated the Williams farmstead site in 2009. The project was initiated when the Texas Department of Transportation approved plans to extend Highway 45 toll road near Manchac. And this is actually the toll road right here in blue. And you can see the site where the road is actually the highway is cutting right through. Research on the site spanned from 2008 and 2015, and fieldwork was concentrated in the area of the dwelling remains and adjacent artifact concentrations that turned out to be a possible outbuilding and midden. Terry Myers, the Farmstead Project's historian, discovered that Ransom and Sarah Williams, both born enslaved, and their freeborn children occupied this farmstead for roughly 30 years. In 1871, Kentucky native Ransom Williams purchased 45 acres in the rural community known as Bear Creek near Manchac for $180. His property was located near what would become the town of Manchac in 1881. Manchac. Ransom likely raised and trained horses. In 1872, he registered a horse brand with Travis County. The farmstone corral, the assorted horse-bladed hardware, and a portion of the brand was recovered from the site during excavations, and all of this gives further evidence of Ransom's work with horses and livestock. This was a skilled occupation that likely provided him with the means to purchase land just 6 years after emancipation. Several years later, Ransom married Sarah Houston, who was employed as a cook in nearby Austin. It is important to note that Ransom and Sarah and their family members prior to emancipation are not found in many archival documents, and after emancipation, they are not enumerated in the U.S. population or agricultural census records during their occupation of the farmstead. Members of the family start to actually show up in the 1900 U.S. Census, and combined with the children's marriage and death certificates, the project historian was able to identify the couple's offspring. The 1920 U.S. Census, Sarah reports that Sarah gave birth to 9 children, yet only 7 have been identified in other records, and perhaps only 7 lived to adulthood. Although Ransom passes away in 1901, the family members remained on the farm until 1905. Now, Ransom and Sarah were among the original settlers of Bear Creek, and their neighbors were all white. These 16 other families, not all of these families are actually portrayed on this figure, hailed from 7 states, including 4 from Texas. 5 families were from Prussia, Ireland, Bavaria, and Canada. The Williamses were the only African Americans living here until the Hughes family arrived in 1884. It's another Black family. Wayne Roberson described the Bear Creek community as mostly comprised of dispersed farmsteads, where people remained separated by several acres. The community lacked a church and school and any other major features of agricultural life, so both Blacks and whites likely traveled outside of this area to participate in social activities. And this was at least the case until roughly about the late 1880s. Although the Williamses may have been cordial with their neighbors, the family likely attended an all-Black church and school. And since Sarah and Ransom were both illiterate, their children would have also likely gone to school in town. African Americans did not establish a school in the Rose-Colored community until the late 1870s, and the area did not get an AME church until 1889. The excavations revealed that the Williamses resided in a 15 by 16 log cabin set on stone footings with an open porch, stone hearth, and chimney. The site's sole subfloor pit was a root cellar in front of the hearth, and there was an outbuilding that functioned as a storage shed for horse tack and harness gear. And as I noted before, pointed out in previous pictures, further out, the landscape features shed light on the family's effort to use the large limestone outcrops on their property to mark their boundaries and to manage their farmstead operations. About half of the property was actually cleared for planting, and Ransom left some of his land also unimproved for pasturage and hunting. Relative to most of their African American counterparts who labored for shares, Ransom and Sarah Williams were actually among a small class of Black farmers who were formerly enslaved but able to improve their lot. They still, however, faced the uncertainties of living in a society where anti-Black racism did not distinguish between landed and landless Blacks. Like most Blacks who acquired land, Ransom's land was less than ideal for farming, with thin and rocky soils. Moreover, there were no streams or creeks that ran through the property. This is why we found no wells or cisterns on the farmstead during excavations. Thus, while the family may have grown small crops of cotton and corn, they largely had to rely on Ransom's income from raising and selling horses. The archaeological data, however, suggests that the Williams family had to carefully maneuver through a precarious postbellum landscape by strategically using the material culture to blend into their surrounding community. Minimal improvements were made to the structures on the farmstead, and Ransom and Sarah Williams remained in their log cabin, and I just wanted to point this out, excuse me. They remained in their log cabin despite their many additions to their family. Terry Jordan, a cultural geographer, studied Texas log cabins and highlighted that this was a common example of vernacular architecture that was impervious to race and class. He notes that Blacks and whites in Texas both lived in log cabins, which were not just used for residential purposes, but were structures that served other agricultural or even business purposes. However, when considered with the family's conspicuous absence from the census, the limited improvement of the Williams' home seems to be an intentional strategy to minimize one's presence on the natural landscape. This may have been an important strategy aimed at obscuring any major signs of economic advancement to avoid raising the envy of white neighbors. Such actions would be necessary to survival, as white envy over Black economic success was often cited by Ida B. Wells as a key motive in lynching. It is also important to note that land ownership and the accumulation of wealth represented the ultimate paradox of Black freedom, and that is former property owning property. While the full granting of land would not have ensured full Black and white equality or the complete economic security of formerly enslaved individuals, Black land ownership posed a threat to the ideological underpinnings of white supremacy because the acquisition of property in terms of land, money, and human capital and the enfranchisement were within the domain of whites prior to the abolition of slavery. Thus, Black landowners therefore carefully had to toe the line of placing themselves at the margins of society to get an economic foothold in society. Arthur Raper further offers explanation for what could be viewed as a form of code switching when he notes that Black land ownership was the result of more than likely a personal equation than a purely business transaction. Raper argued that the process of Black land ownership included whites finding a prospective owner that was acceptable. The author states, whether a particular Negro can buy, and I'm quoting this for full intent, whether a particular Negro can buy a particular tract of land depends upon its location, its economic and emotional value to the white owner and other white people, the Negro's cash and credit resources, and doubtless most important of all, his personal qualities in the light of the locals' attitudes. He must be acceptable, and being acceptable means that he and his family are industrious and that his credit is good. It means that he is considered safe by local people. He knows his place and he stays in it, end quote. Though this varies, Raper further notes that this may have varied from one community to another and one individual to another, the definition of place hedged the Negro landowner around restrictions that ultimately, he argues, made them akin to the chronic dependency of landless Blacks. Raper notes that ultimately that the Negro landowner was essentially an independent Negro farmer rather than an independent farmer. However, and I'm beginning to wrap this up, such maneuvering should not be solely interpreted as an attempt as Black landowners to avoid violence. Black landowners like Ransom Williams may have also carefully balanced social distance with cordiality for their sustenance. The archaeology from the farmsteads indicates that Ransom and Sarah Williams actively participated in the local consumer market. They made frequent trips to Austin to purchase not just ceramics, but medicinal items, kitchen items, medicinal items, and other household and dry goods. The household bought a few leisure goods, but these were not represented in large numbers, neither were toys, instruments, or alcohol. The Williams family heavily exploited the natural landscape to become self-sufficient and to sustain themselves, and the faunal and floral evidence indicate that the efforts of the family to live off the land to avoid debt was largely successful. The macrobotanical evidence shows that they grow peaches, sweet potatoes, and as well as consumed an indigenous plant called pokeweed. They ate nuts and walnuts and pecans, and they ate domestic fauna such as pork, beef, and poultry, while also consuming lots of wild animals like raccoons, possum, and cottontail rabbits. Ransom and his sons likely hunted on their property, but perhaps maintained affable relations with their white neighbors with water sources on their property for the purpose of caring for livestock. Excavations uncovered several fish hooks as well as barrel bands that hint at the family's need for copious amounts of water and possibly the sort of like fluid boundaries that they did with their neighbors to obtain this. So, I'm ultimately highlighting a few aspects from the material culture with the whole purpose to ultimately get us to maybe just broaden our minds of how we think about segregation. And I want us to remember that the years following the demise of Reconstruction brought acts of violence, political disenfranchisement, economic impoverishment, but freed Blacks also continued to face racial exclusion as they turned inward to develop their own institutions and networks of support. While recent studies of sites like New Philadelphia have challenged the conception of such communities as being self-segregated or all Black enclaves, the examination of sites like the Ransom and Sarah Williams farmstead also trouble our both popular and scholarly traditional understandings of the color line during the postbellum period. A reconceptualization of Jim Crow expands both public and scholarly understandings of race relations, and they do this by ultimately demonstrating how race and the cultural practices that shaped its meaning can be shaped by the specificity of place. This can have great implications for the writing of history, for scholars can ultimately find examples of how neither Blacks nor whites behaved according to their preconceived expectations or assumptions. Although this can provoke a range of emotions as well as contemporary sociopolitical consequences that should be weighed carefully, there's a bigger lesson about this, about the production of historical accounts that don't flatten the complex range of human action by portraying people as simply responding to racism, but also showing that the ways that their behavior was influenced by overlapping identities or socio-political, economic, and regional conditions. Thank you.